Well, thank you all for an amazing overview of the challenges and potential successes along the way that you're seeing. I'd like to have a brief conversation amongst the five of us and then open it up to our audience for questions. There will be roving mics, I believe, during Q&A, and of course, feel free to tweet any questions you have using the hashtag #ShareHumanity. Brian, I thought I'd start with you. In your world that you created, or country that you created for us in your opening, there's a clear need for a new way of doing humanitarian assistance. What are the challenges to shifting from the old model to a potential new model, and are you seeing that shift starting to occur?
I think several people have already mentioned what I see as the central challenge. The system we have works pretty well. As a matter of fact, it works much better than it did 10 years ago. We're reaching more people in more places at a higher standard than we have ever before. So that's the good news. The bad news is, as I was trying to explain, is it's falling short. We're actually failing a greater number of people than we failed before for the lack of resources. So clearly this new approach is called for. So the major obstacle is a resistance of altering the system that we know works well enough for a great number of people and risk stretching it too far to help more people. And that, there's a number of dimensions to that challenge. One is the way that we're set up. We, as the humanitarian community, always have seen ourselves as the firefighters. The 911 call sounds, and we come in, and we get the people out of the burning building, and we put out the fire. That's not actually the case. As I was trying to explain earlier, the emergency is actually not a 90-day emergency when we're first in and first out. We're there for years and years and years. And what we have to do is overcome the second challenge I would identify is that we have to change the time frame that we see ourselves working in. We have to understand that these problems didn't come out of nowhere. They took a long time, the causes underneath them, to develop and to cause the actual emergency that we're dealing with. By that same logic, it will take us a lot of work to resolve the issues that got us in the first place. So we can't treat only the symptoms that we see that are the most visible. We have to also go to dealing with what's underneath it. Not we, only the humanitarian community, the people that we're used to seeing in emergency response. We need to work with a much broader range of partners, people we're not used to working with, groups that we're not used to talking to, speaking languages and using terminology that we're not comfortable with ourselves. So I think that's the set of challenges that is preventing us from making change more quickly. That said, I'm optimistic. I think the challenges are so great. The awareness across the board of what the challenges are is so great. And the amount of attention being paid to the challenges we face is at a level we haven't seen in years and years, and this is our opportunity to make it. My note of pessimism or warning there would be that this might be our last big opportunity for the next 10 years. It was 10 years ago where we rebuilt our system the last time. It may be another 10 years before we have this challenge.
Great. So a big moment here in potentially shifting that model.
Absolutely.
And Fabio, you have the unique vantage point based on some of the examples you showed us of working in this space, but from a business perspective. Mm-hmm. And Brian speaks to the need for engaging new types of actors, including the business community. What are the challenges of that engagement, and how do you see us moving forward?
Well, there are definitely many different facets to that answer. We discussed this morning, for the people in the audience who didn't know, we had a session in the morning that also tried to kind of come to certain conclusions around this question. And some of the problems that were flagged relate to a lack of shared vocabularies. For example, when we're talking about business drivers or money making as a mandate for a lot of the commercial kind of players out there, a large portion of the humanitarian community is still, from what we see, uncomfortable with that idea of adopting that language or talking about beneficiaries in terms of consumers. And so I think there are bridges that need to be built to really be able to kind of speak to one another with a certain clarity around mandates and a certain clarity around objectives. And then you could even say that there are limits within the businesses, so within the for-profit organizations, because there is this kind of pretty kind of clear-cut division between the money-making part of a company and this, the corporate social responsibility part of the company. And very often when a humanitarian organization kind of starts a conversation around, can we do something together, the immediate response from the business side of the house is like, go talk to the CSR people. And clearly that conversation skews the opportunity to really go beyond the funding model and actually talk about combining maybe more of a business value creation objective with a social value creation objective. And it's interesting to see that there are right now large organizations, business organizations, for example, Unilever is one, that has decided to stop talking about that division and has merged, has essentially said, we need to embed social sensitivity in everything that we do, as a business practice, and not necessarily kind of saying, here's where we, again, make money, and then that's where we help the world. And so as maybe some of these barriers get broken down, new opportunities will arise in the same, I think, optimistic kind of view of the world. Maybe humanitarian organizations will be more and more open to embrace this kind of mixed models and looking at shared value creation as one of their core areas of interest. And as the two come together, there will be more and more opportunities, to bring meaningful change while not necessarily seeing that as separate from maybe driving a business.
Jim, I'm seeing you nodding your head vigorously over there. It sounds like a lot of the challenges that Fabio mentioned are ones you actually stumbled upon very directly. Are you seeing a shift in terms of the embedding of these issues into the core part of the private sector, or do you still see ongoing challenges there?
I think it's still a challenge because these are businesses that are relentlessly focused on making a lot of money, and yet they have to recruit people. And let's just say the recruiting environment here in Silicon Valley is kind of tough these days. And an awful lot of the talent that they want to acquire want to see their company doing something important for society. So it's not just the CSR part, but how is my job going to be involved with actually doing social good? And how can we make sure that we not be evil? I mean, there's a large thing about Apple's stance against the FBI that is about standing for something bigger than just making money, even though some people might say it is about making money. But I think it actually is, the talent side is almost as important as the money-making side in some of these issues. I think people are surprised when I tell them that if I go and ask a Silicon Valley tech company for their intellectual property for free, they say yes 80% of the time. Because I'm asking them for it for a market that they've already decided they can't make money on. So it costs them almost nothing, and they can look good to their employees, and what we pay them back with is essentially a story of how these Googlers helped this community health worker app help 5 million people in Asia get better health care. And so it actually, it hasn't changed that they're focused on making money, but it makes the people who want the company to do the right thing, it strengthens their case because they have this asset that they can let go for very little money, and the talent issue, this drive of the employees to want to be something bigger than just making money is actually influencing some of these decisions.
Yeah, if I may just briefly add to that, I do also see though more and more interest from again, the corporate, the corporate side again of the house of our clients. In understanding these markets, and so, for example, the Wearables for Good competition was definitely the first kind of step in a collaboration between ARM and UNICEF, where ARM, the chipset design company, really has an interest in engaging with UNICEF because they recognize that UNICEF has an unmatchable understanding of the market needs in places where ARM has no presence. And so as they think about, the next generation low power, low transmission, chipsets, who better than UNICEF, can be a partner in really creating the right channels for profit organization to reach markets that are their growth markets, and so I think that dynamic is also in place and can be a positive dynamic if harnessed properly.
Yeah. Well, these are great points that talk to this concern that was raised earlier this morning around what's the business case. And I'm hearing two very strong business cases coming out of this panel that may just have to reframe the way that we've traditionally thought about return on investment.
And sorry, if I may come in there and just comment on what Jim and Fabio have just said. You know, we're seeing a similar shift on the humanitarian side. When I started in this business, which is now $20 billion a year, we were very much the good guys, and everybody was not as much the good guys. The private sector were out there, and maybe they could do things to help us, mainly give us money. But even when they gave us money, we were slightly suspicious. Now, look, humanitarians can come across as very idealistic and unrealistic, but it's not the case at all. We are extremely realistic. We can be very astute about what's going on out there. And we realize that the private sector has capacities that they need, that we need, and that the people that we're trying to help can benefit from. To us, that's our bottom line. It has to be in line with the principles, but our bottom line is that people get help. We're less and less attached to who provides that help, so long as it's in line with the principles. So I think there's a very natural point of connection that we're headed towards.
And the SDGs are definitely also opening up, you know, they're setting up, I think, this collaboration in a much more explicit way compared to the past. So there's encouragement also from, again, the global kind of community to have these kind of cross-sector partnerships as operating models to solve problems.
So we're in the Bay Area, not far from Silicon Valley, where there's a lot of excitement about technological innovations. And Jim, I'm wondering if you have a response to the criticism that innovation is always seen, or technology is always seen as a panacea, or could be seen as a panacea. Is there a counter-argument there, and what's your take?
Well, I would echo sort of Brian's comment. If you actually build software, it's very frustrating to it not being used. And so you actually want to see it benefit. And you know, there's a lot more invention going on than there actually is innovation that's happening at scale. But that's not a surprise. You know, the average tech company gets started doesn't go to scale and become a billion-dollar company. And so I think that, you know, we do have to kind of back off from the latest jazzy sort of, you know, the blockchain is going to solve all humanitarian problems. I've heard it. You know, we actually have to kind of balance that. And frankly, when I talk to nonprofit sector folks, and you look at the technology they're using, they're often 5, 10, or 15 years behind the times in terms of their technology use. Not less in the large organizations, but in smaller organizations, they're often quite far behind. And so some of the things that they need are actually kind of boring by Silicon Valley gee whiz sort of standards. But you know, this incremental improvement of how can we be 10% or 20% more efficient, that's actually kind of lower risk than how do I invent something that's 10 times better. And we need both of those things going on. But I would temper some of the, you know, very optimistic promises that, you know, next week this amazing new technology is going to sweep the nonprofit sector, because it generally hasn't happened that way.
And Tamina, your opening remarks talk about the need for testing interventions, and that they may not always be as successful as we hope. You talked specifically about the case in Sierra Leone of randomized control trials. And I'm wondering, practically, how can you do that in complex humanitarian emergencies? How can we get the data that we need to actually test potential interventions?
There are a couple of solutions to that. One is this idea, as I mentioned, of sort of sentinel sites, where we have research ongoing in vulnerable communities. It's pretty low cost to scale rapidly a survey and try to understand not only what people are experiencing, but what is their response to an intervention. I think there isn't a lot of investment in that kind of experimentation, in part because it's really difficult and it's hard to identify researchers who work in site in the middle of a crisis. But also, I think the shift towards private sector investments, we may lose some of the accountability that traditionally humanitarian agencies are held to. Humanitarian agencies are very risk averse because they have to demonstrate impact. They have to perform on certain outcome measures. The private sector isn't held to that standard, right? There's no consumer here that's going to hold accountable the provider of an app that didn't really work. And so I think while there are a lot of new technologies being rolled out and new opportunities, the take-up of those technologies could be slowed by a lack of evidence that they work. So I think there is a demand for new technologies. There's also a higher bar. They do need to demonstrate that there is a positive benefit, a positive impact on recipient communities. Again, I think it is really difficult to do experiments in these settings. There's no easy solution, but leveraging the investments that researchers are already making is one opportunity. And then testing interventions that build resilience, that is much easier because you can invest in interventions, in randomized rollout, be measuring people's responses to those interventions, and ultimately when a crisis does hit, you just need to collect some end-line data and you understand how people responded. So on the resilience side and building the resilience of communities to risks, I think it is easier in some sense to collect data and understand impacts.
And one of the things that SIGA focuses on is around community participation and community engagement. And are there technology tools that can help assist in that? Or what are the ways that we can do that effectively and make sure that we're bringing those voices back into our development processes and design processes?
Well, we're relying a lot on technology companies that provide, for example, very low-cost, high-frequency data collection. Some of the satellite startups that are providing daily images of the Earth, that allows us to see human movements, changes in human settlements at an incredibly high frequency and high spatial resolution. There are companies like the wearables that are distributing sensors throughout communities and allowing us to remotely sense how people respond, say, how they're using bridges or other infrastructure, latrines, other things that are added into the built environment. We can now measure how people respond to those interventions. And of course, there are all the mobile survey, SMS, call centers, all the innovation in ICT that allows us to get a pulse on what people are experiencing, allows us to aggregate voices, and just capture massive amounts of quantitative data. So I think there, technology providers play a really important role in giving a voice to people who are living in risk, who are living in unsafe environments, and are difficult to reach.
Okay. Maybe, Fabio, could you talk about this a little bit in terms of engaging with the end user in the design process and thinking through how do we get their voices into that early stage of development?
Yeah, as I was trying to quickly point out, in the 5-minute introduction, I think that's essentially how designers kind of see themselves. They often talk about their role as being the user's advocate or the voice of the user, and we have at this stage again established methodologies to engage communities or individuals, and there's a big difference. So if you're working in the kind of commercial space, you're often talking about a consumer, and you're talking about a one-to-one relationship, and research tends to be oriented towards understanding the individual and their individual needs. Very often when we're talking about the humanitarian kind of sector, we're talking about communities as a group. And so very different engagement models when it comes to, again, purely trying to get their voice raised. So I could talk for hours about participatory design and all of the techniques and that we have over time adopted or evolved. I think it's also interesting just to briefly mention the pure fact of these emerging technologies being used to give people a voice. So, for example, again, our UNICEF friends have done an amazing job, with what they call the YouReport platform that was dispatched, for example, during the Ebola crisis, to just simply let people express their opinion in their own terms, and especially engaging with the younger portion of the population, or observing what the current people fleeing Syria towards Europe, what they're doing with mobile phones. And so in many ways, for us also as part-time ethnographers, there's really a lot of interest in understanding what people do with the technology that they're given that we could actually learn from. So once you see how technology has been applied to solve problems in a way that it was maybe not necessarily intended to, all of a sudden, I think we can be inspired and go back and maybe offer solutions that remap to essentially what you're already observing on the ground.
Well, I have lots more questions, but I imagine our audience does as well. Does anyone have a question for our panelists? I think Ferris over here has the mic, and Brandy in the back has a mic. I think we've got one right up here in the front.
So as you guys were talking about the private sector and technology, I kind of want to hear your thoughts on internet.org and how do you walk this narrow line of kind of including more of the private sector and adding more services, but also protecting the vulnerable from being exploited?
Anyone want to take
That's
that?
a hot potato. Well, you know, it's highly controversial, as you're aware. You know, people do see Facebook's approach to giving away zero-rated services as being very much in their commercial interest as opposed to social good interest. And people inside Facebook are almost as vehemently arguing the opposite case. And this is a great debate for democracies to tackle. And different countries, I think, are going to come to different conclusions on whether or not they want to take advantage of the largesse of the tech industry as it's offered. Because sometimes the strings are more clearly attached than they are in other cases.
Other questions? Yeah, right here in the front.
I wanted to ask about metrics and measurement. If we're talking about a rapid innovation cycle, randomized control trials are really difficult to help you iterate on your product. So what are the measures we can use, considering that emergency warning systems, we still don't know how many lives they're saving? How do we measure this?
Brian, do you want to talk at all about what measurements are currently in place, perhaps?
Sure. Again, it's a tough question, but the places where we have been able to measure a little bit better, one example leaps to mind is Bangladesh. So it was 25, 30 years ago, 200,000 people were lost in a cyclone. Bangladesh has actually come quite a long way in its preparedness measures. And one of them is something we discussed in the workshop earlier. It's the mobile phone alerts. So simply by measuring how many people live in the affected area, how many people were killed in the previous storm of that intensity, and looking at how many people were not killed this time around, you can deduce that you know, more than 100,000 lives, sorry, more than 190,000 lives were saved this time around, the cyclone that hit 3-4 years ago as compared to the one that hit about 25 years ago. So it's getting better, but it is very hard to measure because we don't have those baselines in every country. We don't know exactly who would have been lost or not, but you know, with things like GPS mapping of the populations and how badly an area has been flooded, it's not too hard to figure out who was able to get away and how many people were. And see from there how many people that mechanism actually saved.
I would just add, there's measurement on different time scales. So some questions can be asked with rapid feedback, and other questions like the impact of an emergency warning system require many years and different methods. So I think it depends on the question you want to answer. There are a lot of useful insights on features for an intervention that can be solved quickly by instrumenting the intervention or collecting quick feedback. Participatory design, that doesn't necessarily require years and years of study. So there are different things to be measured and different time scales, different methods.
And I think going further, there's a big mismatch between, I'd say, donor demand for evidence of impact and donor willingness to fund the gathering of that evidence. And so in the meanwhile, I think the more that we're using technology, hopefully effectively, technology comes instrumented. You almost, you have to actively throw away data, and maybe for privacy reasons you should, but we're going to be gathering an awful lot more data, and in the context of the SDGs, I think that we'll see more and more nonprofits using technology to improve their program outcomes, just run their organizations, their interventions more effectively on the assumption that if they deliver more food to people when it's needed, it's going to be a good thing. And more that's going to throw off a data trail that we're going to be able to link with these larger data sets, with the satellite imagery that Tamina mentioned. And it's going to put more and more of this power of data in the hands of the nonprofit sector. I mean, when I talk to people about Google about a new problem, they say, first, assume we know everything. Now what will we do? And they're not kidding. We don't operate like that in the nonprofit sector, sometimes for good reasons. But I think that we're going to have to start thinking that way of, if we had a lot more data, how can we, as someone who respects human rights and respects privacy, still use that data to be much more effective at delivering social good for basically how to stretch those limited dollars that we never have enough, which I think is Brian's framing is everybody's trying to figure out how can we do twice as much for the same amount of money. That's a core requirement in our field.
And I think the multilaterals play an important role because they can convene the partners. In the wake of the Ebola crisis, we couldn't get access to mobile call detail records. We didn't have the data sharing agreements in place. We didn't have trust between the researchers, the telco operators, the government agencies. So doing some advanced work to facilitate those kinds of linkages can yield real fruit.
But OCHA has been taking very active steps, and we've actually been involved in that work as well. In Humanitarian Data Exchange platform, and there is a strategy to kind of really put the big data that's out there at the use of the larger humanitarian community, clearly with all of the complexities of respecting privacy and sensitivity towards certain types of data, et cetera. But I think you have really taken an active role in promoting that conversation.
OCHA certainly has, and it's part of a shift that the community is trying to make more generally in not seeing ourselves as at the center, at the lead all the time, but this convening role. We can be the connector, we can be the facilitator. If that's our comparative advantage, that's the role we should play. It's not necessarily about putting a truck in and getting something on the truck and getting that truck to the village. It's how do we connect the boat, the load, the truck, and somebody to receive it in the village.
And I've got a great example of that convening authority. We incubated the main human rights data analysis group in the field, and the question of how many people are being killed in Syria is a big one. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has the convening power to get all the people who maintain basically casualty lists, who all say that they have the one true list, because that's what you do when you're in that field, but to get 7 different lists, including one from the Syrian government. And then we designed the technology to match that data up and come up with the numbers that frequently the High Commissioner comes up with based on, and we couldn't have gotten that data if it hadn't been for essentially the moral authority of the UN to say, no, share it with us and we'll actually do this process of coming up with a number that people could actually count on better than any one of the numbers that you might have heard.
And sorry if I'm talking too much here, but the accuracy of those numbers helps the convener, the UN, maintain the moral high ground. If we are using numbers that are proven incorrect or that are not precise enough, we then undermine our own strength, which is having that authority. So again, it's where this partnership comes in, where we need the people with the skills, with the information that can help us, and it continues like this. If we don't have the information, if we cannot answer the question, slowly but surely, or rather quickly but surely, we will lose the authority. We will lose the ground we stand on. We'll lose the pulpit from which to speak.
Well, I may steal the last question, if that's all right. We've been talking a lot about interventions and the challenge of testing them, but we haven't talked about the challenge of scaling them. And I might leave the last comment to Jim and Brian here to talk about what are those challenges to scaling potential solutions in complex humanitarian emergencies.
So usually in technology, it's sustainability. How do you keep this going, right? And our goal is not often to make money, but it is to pay the staff that work on this to actually give the kind of support that is actually needed. And so the kind of Fabio's sort of approach to design actually helps ensure that the solution that you're coming up with actually is needed, because that's really what ignites something going to scale, is when the early adopters say it's great, and you learn a lot from that, and you actually then make a product that can be actually used by the mainstream actual user, whether that's a member of a disadvantaged community or the NGOs or agencies that are serving them. But the model and the revenue models, they're all very similar to what Silicon Valley does. And we often go into a project imagining what would a for-profit Silicon Valley company try to do to make some money off of this. We'll try all 5. It's just, for us, being $1 million a year break-even venture is a gigantic success in the nonprofit sector, even if it's a complete and utter failure by Silicon Valley terms.
And I'll try to answer as well. I mean, the easy thing for me to do, which is always very tempting, is to say, well, the donors don't invest enough in that, therefore we can't do it. But the answer that we should give from our side in the humanitarian world is actually it requires more discipline from us. We have had a number of success stories where new tools, new techniques have yielded great results, and then somehow they're lost in the sands of time. They're not applied in another place. It's incumbent upon the community under this economic strain of not being able to meet the needs to get better, more disciplined, better connected, and use the good examples we have across the board. It sounds very simple, but it's not. When you're talking about OCHA coordinates the work of at least 14 humanitarian agencies from the UN, and there's dozens more NGOs behind that that are even closer to the ground doing the work. So it's going to take a remarkable culture change, but it's one that we all realize that we have to do.
Well, thank you all so much. We've had a great discussion about the challenges, from the significant humanitarian challenge that exists today to the challenges around technological innovations, language barriers, scaling challenges, community engagement challenges, and hopefully the next panel will provide us with a list of solutions to all of those challenges. But I do hear a lot of optimism on the stage today, and hopefully we can take that forward and start to incubate new ideas and bring them to scale. Thank you.